Well, GoFundMe has caused quite a stir after they removed funds from the Freedom Convoy 2022, which had raised almost $10 million. We're going to talk about the Freedom Convoy and this angle to the story with Trey Goins-Phillips and Billy Hallowell. Hey, guys, what's going on?
Doing well, doing well.
Well, as you know, Billy says it's another, what is it? We're in a living the dream, right?
Well, we're living the dream, and it's almost the weekend. That's what I say from Monday all the way through Friday. So
there you go. There you go. Well, GoFundMe, guys, has really created some controversy here because there was an outpouring of support for this Freedom Convoy that just went crazy and got about $10 million worth of funds raised to help people who were trying to take part in that, which a lot of people were mocking that, Trudeau had called this a small fringe minority. And now it's this small fringe minority apparently is such a giant problem that they've had to declare a national, or a state of emergency in Ottawa, which is kind of funny. Those two things don't seem to be, if it's a small fringe minority, you wouldn't think they could shut down the whole city there with everyone. But the convoy has made its way to Ottawa. And Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson declared that state of emergency over the weekend. There's about 500 trucks and vehicles there. And they now are just sort of lingering in the streets. And it's basically a standoff at this point. But guys, and there's only, by the way, there's only been about 5 or 7 arrests and 100 citations. And there's thousands of people there. So relatively, that's a small number. Obviously, whatever these people did in those things, not excusing that, but relatively speaking, overall, small number. But nevertheless, guys, GoFundMe has really caused quite the controversy here because they said that it's now shifted into violence and danger, and so therefore they're going to remove the funds.
So my assumption is they've never, ever allowed anybody to fundraise for any other event or any other thing that has been associated with or had any kind of violence involved with it whatsoever. But I'm sure that's obviously not the case. I think, though, in fairness to GoFundMe, and I know people are going to cringe with me even saying in fairness to GoFundMe, I think because of the way culture is and because of all of the chaos, there's that fear of if we give the money and then something happens, we're accountable. And now if we don't give the money, you're sort of weighing the odds. Who are we going to make more angry? So there's that factor. And then I think there's the other factor we all know about, which is the ideological bias that people feel is afoot in all of social media. And that extends into some of these crowdfunding sites.
Yeah, I think people would be less upset if, like you alluded to, Billy, there wasn't that double standard, not just with GoFundMe, but in the media as a whole. If they just covered all of this stuff fairly, whether it's Black Lives Matter protests or if it's the Freedom Convoy or, the March for Life, whatever it is, if they would give equal coverage and fair coverage to all of it, I think people would be less apt to complain. But because it's so biased and oftentimes like the Freedom Convoy has been completely ignored for the most part in the United States, the March for Life never gets any coverage. So when you look at the larger context, I think that's why people get so frustrated, not just with GoFundMe, but with the media as a whole and how they cover these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking of the media as a whole, there's a couple clips. I mean, CNN was having a segment on this, and John King labeled the Freedom Convoy as a nationwide insurrection. And so they were saying that it's a danger and that it's quote unquote sedition and a quote threat to democracy. And they said, and then another guest there on that CNN segment with John King said, and just think of the language. I know it sounds familiar to you, a threat to democracy, an insurrection, sedition. So trying to liken it to, remember January 6th, it seems to be what they're almost hoping for here. But it's really interesting because you mentioned, Billy, like surely they haven't done anything like this in the past, GoFundMe that is. And you look at this tweet here where this was back July 2nd, 2020. We had a lot of protests going around in the country. And if you remember, CHOP, which was the area there where they went in Seattle and basically took over. The police retreated out of the city. And they just took over this whole section, couple city blocks, and we're just occupying there. And this is what GoFundMe. This, mind you, this tweet came after a murder had already happened in the chop zone there. So complete lawlessness, violence, looting of stores, everything else. This is what GoFundMe writes. In a community with no police, this farmer is feeding people and bringing them closer together. Learn how you can support Marcus's mission within the chop.
As though it's a country, within the chop.
I mean, it's not even just existing on the GoFundMe page, this GoFundMe for Marcus's mission to feed the people in chop. They amplify it with this heartwarming toned message on it. It's just remarkable that, and this is still up. This is not down, by the way. They haven't tried to shove this one down the memory hole. It's remarkable to me that they can say with a straight face, hey, we need to just take that $10 million away because it's getting violent out there. And they can have a tweet like this after people had been murdered in chop.
Yeah, I mean, this is the double standard that we were talking about, right? And I think there's a challenge in all of this for all of us, especially as Christians, right? Because I think as human beings, we have a tendency when we see an ideology we don't like, or we see a movement we don't like, to sort of pull out the 3, 4, 5, or 7 people in this case who have been arrested. I don't know what they did, but to take those people, or the few people who had flags with swastikas on them. We've seen all these headlines about the convoy. You've got thousands of people and there's 10 people doing this one thing. Will they become emblematic of that entire movement then? And that, as human beings, is something that we are prone to do. And we've done it with all different protests. It happens on both sides. I think as believers, we do have to take a step back and say, even looking at this, okay, here's something that maybe we don't have a problem with, and we see that happening here. How can we not do that next time? It's a really good cautionary lesson for us. But yeah, to your point, there's that double standard. And I think it just reminds me, okay, what can we do in our house to make sure that next time there's a protest we don't like, whether it's another Occupy Wall Street or whatever other thing pops up, that we don't take the 3 or 4 people and make them the symbol of the entire thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying, Billy. I think the interesting thing, though, with this is it's such a perfect one-to-one comparison, because the reason that GoFundMe has so far withheld the funds is because they've said that they can't support an occupation that's having dangerous ramifications in an area. CHOP was literally, by definition, an occupation that was violent, like you said, Billy. They pushed the police out, and they not only allowed the funds to go through, but GoFundMe promoted it. And then the Freedom Convoy comes around. And by the way, the Freedom Convoy truckers have been trying to negotiate and work with police. I'm not saying all of them have, but the leadership has been trying to work with the police and have not been overly violent. So it's, how is one okay? And not only okay, but, laudatory, and the other one is, well, we just can't give them the money because it's an occupation. Like,
yeah,
you were all gung-ho about one occupation.
Well, and there's no comparison.
So what's the issue with this one?
But there's no and I just wanted to add to what I was saying before, because I don't want to make it seem like there's no comparison. What was happening in CHOP should have never been allowed to happen. They were literally running an entire area and there was no law and order whatsoever. This is a nuisance and an annoyance to people who don't like it and they want it gone, but they're very different things, and we just have to avoid, I think, that next time this happens, we need to be better than what we're watching the media do now. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, and I think this is where I think people, trust in the media again it just continues to plummet, and I think it's because people can see the agendas. During the, Black Lives Matter protests back in 2020, there were times that it did get out of control and it did get violent. And you saw the media try to say, well, mostly peaceful, as there were buildings burning in the background, which was just ridiculous. But then there were times in those same different protests throughout the country where I saw Black Lives Matter people yelling at the anarchist, goons who had always show up at these protests and start smashing windows. And they were telling them to stop it. So there was a variety of people there, and it would just be easier if we didn't have agendas and we could just report what we were seeing. Like, hey, all the buildings behind me are on fire. This isn't good.
This isn't mostly peaceful.
Right. This isn't mostly peaceful. But then when you see, BLM protesters yelling at the anarchists and telling them to stop it, we don't want violence, you can praise that as well. I mean, this is not hard to do. And with a Freedom Convoy here, you should be able to just objectively look at it and say, okay, this is a big deal. And I think that that's the other thing that's frustrating people when they watch the media This was tried. They tried to dismiss this as I said earlier. Trudeau called it a small fringe minority, and now it's this giant thing, and they're saying it's an insurrection. Well, which is it? Is it a small, insignificant minority, or is it an insurrection that's a threat to democracy? What? You can't have both ways, and it just makes it obvious that you have an agenda, and you're not reporting based on what you're seeing. You're reporting based on your ideological belief.
Yeah. And it seems like the big problem here is how does this end, right? Because you have the government basically saying at this point, and I think from a strategic standpoint, there's some elements of it that are understandable. You can't just have people come to the Capitol and make demands and then, we go out and negotiate with them. That sets a terrible standard. Okay, you could say you understand that argument, but then what is the solution? Somebody has to get tired first here, right? And give in some way. So that's the part for me watching it and thinking, okay, your goal is to get rid of these vaccine mandates. They're saying they're never going to even talk to you about this. I don't know, like what happens? We're a couple weeks into this thing now.
And there's one other angle of the media bias that I think is worth discussing. So back when the Black Lives Matter protests were happening, it was obviously at the height of the pandemic, and so many in the media, so many politicians were saying, but it's worth the risk, right? It's worth the risk of spreading a virus in the midst of a pandemic because it's about an issue that's so important. But now with the Freedom Convoy, people are saying the media is reporting, well, this is so disruptive that it's not good, it's not helpful, it's causing more harm than good. But the reality is that a protest is supposed to be a disruption, right? It's supposed to be a signal that people are upset. And I was just reading this morning. So the Ambassador Bridge, which is between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, it handles about $500 million worth of trade every day. It's been largely shut down completely. And the media's reporting on that being a problem, but it seems like so many in the press are missing the point. They've shut down this bridge, and what's the reason? Because they want their government to start hearing their concerns. Instead, though, the media is just reporting about these disruptions, which is fine. They are real disruptions, but report on why the disruption is happening. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration is coming from.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. And we're going to leave it there, guys. If you want to hear more on this and other news topics going on, head on over to faithwire.com. Sign up for the Faithwire podcast. We're here every day with more news from a Christian perspective. Thanks, guys.